Yeah, I'm going to talk to you, as Kate mentioned, looking at parasites. We're going to talk about gutworms specifically and fluke. So we've got a gutworm test and a fluke test. And we're probably going to spend a bit more time on the gutworms, but we'll touch on fluke as well. And a lot of what I talk about is relevant to both parasites anyway. Yeah, so bit of an introduction to start with. I think I pressed on the wrong screen. Sorry, have I not Sorry. Am I sharing again, Kate?
Well, I can see your first slide, but
There we are.
nothing
That's
has
fine.
moved
Yeah, that's
on.
fine. Yeah, I thought I'd pressed the
Yeah,
wrong button. There we are. Right. Should be coming up now. So,
perfect.
a little bit about us. So Tection is the company, but probably people know us better through our main product, FECPAK. So in terms of the company, privately owned company, our main headquarters is the other side of the globe in Dunedin, in New Zealand. And as you can see there, we have an Australian office. And I'm talking to you from our European or UK base here in Aberystwyth in West Wales. And as you can tell from the Welsh accent, I'm a proud Welshman. We've also got anybody joining from Northern Ireland. We've got distributors, Agribite, newly set up distributors over there. People may know Jonathan Burney as a consultancy. It's an arm of their business. We've been in this game a long time, doing a lot, over 20 years experience. I've been talking about this subject for 20 years plus now and selling some of the previous kind of FECPAKs and so on. And we've got networks across the world, done a lot of collaborated with universities, various establishments like Pasture for Life. We've done work with scops and cows and so on. And yeah, sort of over that time, we built up a wide network, and there's a lot of R&D work that we do in New Zealand, and as well as over here. So that's a little bit about kind of just a brief overview of the company, sort of a little bit about FECPAK. As I said, FECPAK's been around, so it's 30 years now the original FECPAK came out. Some of you might recognize that kit there. So the old FECPAK, the G1 if you want, was the microscope and a lab in a box if you want. And we sold, it was bought out in New Zealand, selling to farmers to enable farmers to be able to do fecal egg counts easily on farm. And I was involved in this from 1993, so I've been doing 20 years. Sorry, 2003, sorry. So I've been doing 20 years. And the microscope was really great and really took us to, got some great results. The issue was the microscope's a barrier as well. So it's the use of a microscope, being confident and being able to use a microscope. We can coming up a lot of cases now, and scops have been involved as well, where it could easily to misidentify eggs, not count properly, etc. And there was a fear factor with the microscope. Can I do it properly? And this was a fear factor, just not for on-farm use, but we sell a lot of these kits to vets and retailers. So even vet technicians, vet nurses using it in-house. That was a bit of a fear factor there. So what we've done in the last kind of 10 years is we've developed our G2. So the G2, after that new FECPAK logo there, so it's a bit more of a modern logo look than the old one, is generation 2, and this is our image-based online version where we capture images and put them online and get results back to the user quickly. So it's all software kind of cloud connected stuff. And then, so that's got a lot more robustness about it. I'm going to touch more on this kind of later on in the evening. So yeah, we've been selling that G2 system to vets, to farmers, etc. So as an on-farm system as well. But also last year we opened up our lab service. So our FECPAK lab in Aberystwyth here. So for a postal FEC test, which I'm going to cover as well, and that's sort of our accredited service there. So that's a bit about what FECPAK is and who we are. So what I want to do this evening is, over that 20 years we've been involved, talking to farmers, vets, and various organizations, sort of trying to share what we've learned along the way, a little bit of what we remember at least. Um, So, in terms of parasites, you've got the three parasites there. You've got your gutworms, you've got your fluke, your trematodes. I've got coccidia up here as well. We're not covering coccidia as such, but coccidia is going to be a new development we're going to have coming on board next year, which is quite exciting for speciated. But if we talk about internal parasites, especially the fluke and the gutworms, I'm putting a bold statement out there. That it's the biggest health issue facing our industry, and this is a time when we've got things like blue tongue, and being a bit of a threat there at the moment. The reason why I say it's the biggest health issue facing our livestock industry, I think economically, the parasites we see is something that's pretty widespread across the whole industry. most livestock farmers on this call will be affected by some parasite or other when we're grazing. Obviously, to different degrees. Some will have sort of more problems than others, depending on the management of the farm and locations, etc., and the history of the farm. But it'll be there on the majority of livestock farms. Okay, so I think, unlike some of the other diseases where you might get an outbreak, an abortion storm or whatever, I think in that particular year when you've got an abortion storm or you've had Eurions or something happen, then I think that's a particularly, at that time, that particular disease is going to be worse for you in that period. But I think overall, year on year on year, I think this is something that's commonly there. And I think, as it says there, it's parasites is the second biggest influence on performance and growth after we feed the animal. And the big issue we have now, and I'm going to touch a bit on resistance, is the fact that our wormers aren't working as well as they used to. So the control method that we historically had is not as effective as it used to because due to the advent of resistance. And for me, the reason I think it's a big health issue is I think there's a lot of farms out there where we think we're controlling it because we're going to the retailer or the vets to buy a wormer. And if that wormer is not kind of working properly, we're going to have some subclinical effects and loss of performance. And most of the time, worms don't often, maybe, I think it's a bigger issue with worms that they cause performance loss and subclinical. So it's lambs growing slower than what they could be growing at, or cattle or whatever, growing slower, putting less condition on, etc., rather than obvious clear signs. And it's the cost of that. So rather than deaths or whatever. Having said that, we think we're in control. We've had worms for decades and decades and decades. Since we've been starting intensively farming livestock, we've had parasites, and we should have learned how to deal with it, and we think we can deal with it with drugs. But having said that, PGE, so parasitic gastroenteritis, so the damage like worms do, is still the top of the list for all post-mortem submissions here in Wales, and I know that's replicated elsewhere through the UK as well when we look at post-mortems. So yeah, parasites is still the topper when it comes to post-mortem analysis in terms of the cause of death. So we're not, so it's still not fully in control sort of there. And it's important for us to maintain, welfare and production standards, and also reducing our environmental impact, which I'm going to talk about, which I know is a massive interest for the group here. And obviously, and I think it's becoming a bigger issue as well as we are shifting towards a more forage-based production system. So obviously, the Pasture for Life is very much the kind of that's very core to your values and what you're trying to do. But I think as an industry, there is a push towards to go more forage-based and rely less on purchased feeds. And just to touch on there, in terms of trying to do a production off pasture, for me, I think parasites are potentially more challenging to deal with. We've got, we tend to have longer grazing seasons. We're pushing the grazing season, so we'll have prolonged exposure to these parasites potentially. But also the animals are out there grazing for longer. We're making more use of grassland and grazing. We've got these animals. They're also contaminating our pastures with the eggs, with the parasites as well. So causing maybe, if you went, an increase in parasites versus maybe more traditional methods potentially. And if you're in a more conventional system where we might, a lot of will rely on supplementary feeding, I think supplementary feeding concentrates will mask a lot of the issues of parasites, and reduce the risk and the effects that parasites have. So one of the effects, if we're creep feeding lambs, for example, or creep feeding calves, you're getting less grass intake anyway because some of the nutrition is coming from the concentrate. So that means less grass intake. That's where they pick the worms up from. There'll be less exposure to the parasites. It might help boost the immune system, but it also will potentially help lambs or livestock grow regardless of a parasite effect. However, even in systems which put a lot of concentrate, a lot of purchased feed in, it's what cost that is. If there is a noticed parasite challenge there, then your feed conversion is pretty poor. So your feed, you got more feed to put the same kind of weight on. But I do think, it is probably a challenge that we're going to see more as we get into more pasture-reliant systems. And obviously, regenerative kind of agriculture is a bit of a buzzword now, and obviously something I know a lot within this group are interested in, and being more regenerative in our actions. And for me, it's a bit of a balancing act. This is a slide I put up when I spoke at Groundswell back in June, and on the one side of the balance, it's about doing better for the environment, producing food, but protecting our planet, protecting a lot of the ecosystems on there and enhancing those ecosystems, reducing emissions, and parasites actually have quite a big effect on emissions out there. So it's looking after those kind of insects and dung beetles and so on. But the other side of the balancing act is we are food producers. You know we got to produce our food. We got to feed a growing population. There's going to become more demand on that as we progress in the future. And obviously that's where our core income comes from a farm. So it's having a balancing act between that. And I think in particular when it comes to parasites, the balancing act, it's easy to get this wrong then, this balance. So wait, I could easily tell you to help the planet and save the insects and whatever, and you can stop worming. Okay, you can everybody put their worming guns away and everybody stops worming. But obviously we're going to have welfare implications and we're going to have issues on performance potentially. Okay, potentially welfare implications, but certainly issues when it comes to performance and getting our system to be sustainable and profitable. Okay, so for me to try and get this balancing act right, things like monitoring parasites, keeping an eye on what's happening in terms of parasites, and I'm going to talk a lot about monitoring parasites tonight. That's the key to get that balance right. Okay, when we're looking at this aspect. So it's quite a tricky balance to do. The easiest production you can do is buy lots of bags of feed in and feed them at and house them. So, your types of systems that you'll be running, does present some challenges when it comes to this. And obviously, I'm not going to dwell too much on this because I'm sure a lot of you heard a lot of people talk about the dung beetles. I know there's been a bit of a focus and it's become a bit of a hot topic in the last few years. But yeah, it's not just the dung beetles, there's other insects that land on the dung and feed and live within that kind of environment. But we do know that excessive worming can have an effect on these guys, and they are massively important to our farms, to our ecosystems. In terms of soil health, structure, and grass growth. There's a piece there talking about decreased grass growth productivity, and obviously an important source of insects for birds. So I'm sure you're all well aware and tuned into that, and I'm sure this is a lot of the part of the motivation of why we want to do, be better for the environment and, be members of Pasture for Life and farming in a more sustainable kind of manner, which kind of, we're still producing food, we're looking after the environments, but it is becoming a big part and a big motivator of what we speak about, okay? But the balancing thing here as well, obviously, yes, we massively need to be careful in how we use wormers, but animal welfare is still massively important and performance of welfare. So reducing the regular blanket treatment is what we need to be doing, rather than removing worming altogether blindly. And I do see occasions where I just see worming removed altogether quite blindly. I know I'm done incorrectly, and we have welfare implications then for the animals. Okay, so I just want to touch on wormer resistance quickly. This is a big issue now in the UK, and I'm going to share some stats with you in a minute. But yeah, if you're a regen farmer or a nature-friendly farmer, and we're relying less on wormers, does it matter? This is a question. There's a debate I had last year with a couple of people in a meeting, and actually, well, we're trying to live without wormers. So does it matter? Well, for me, I do think it does matter. Because I think it'll be quite rare for the majority of people joining this call. I'm assuming you've got livestock, and that's why you're on here and listening. It'll be rare for the majority of you to get away with no wormer use at all. Or for your young stock, for your young lambs and young cattle, etc. I don't find many that get away with completely none. You might have quite, the exceptions would be people who've got quite clean grazing systems where we've got grassland and arable rotation, etc. But that comes with its own risks, and we can see parasites explode even in those very clean systems as well. So there could be some on here, but generally it is going to be an issue that we're going to have to deal with a chemical approach every now and again. And I think anthelmintics, the wormers are still an important element of that toolbox that you have. So what we want to show is we're trying to minimize how much we're relying on the wormers, but when we do have to reach for that worm again, it's making sure that it is effective and we are getting good control. Because if it isn't effective, if a wormer treatment we have got resistance and our wormers we're using is not effective, then what that means is we're leaving a proportion of parasites behind. I know some of the tests we're going to show you in a minute, we were leaving half the parasites behind when we were worming them. That means we're continually monitoring, our fecal egg counts are gonna rise quicker, which means the interval to when they next need treating will be shorter. We're also not controlling contamination. One of the major reasons we actually go for a drench gun and the drench bottle is to control contamination. So we don't want to contaminate the pastures with eggs for the future. So part of getting rid of worms is stopping the next generation of worms on the farm as well. So if we've got resistance or fully effective, it's actually we're not stopping the contamination when there's an opportunity to. So it increases the challenge, and those things make collectively will mean that interval to the next wormer we need to worm again fairly soon or sooner than we would have if it was completely effective, and we're not getting that full control. And that's not good news for dung beetles because and other things we're trying to protect. So resistance for me is a real issue that we need to look at. And I would say resistance development as well. If we are running fairly clean systems or semi-clean, or the cleaner our systems get in terms of parasites, there's a risk when we're worming that resistance can develop quicker actually in those clean systems. So it's a bit of a strange one. I'm not going to go into the detail now because it's quite a complex kind of subject, but resistance can develop quicker when we have got some cleaner pastures and we mismanage those pastures and the stock that go onto them. So in terms of where we are in terms of resistance, so there's an assumption there for most farmers going into the retail store to buy a wormer that the wormers we're buying are working. And this is just some very recent data from a project we're running in Wales at the moment. We're in the middle of the project. We've done I've got results from 24 farms to date from last year and this year, where we've been testing on the majority, 5 or 6 different wormers on the farms. And these bars in this graph show the percentage of farms to each wormer that we've tested. So each bar represents a different wormer, the percentage where we found resistance to some extent. Okay, so there's reduced efficacy, I should say. There's reduced efficacy, which is likely to be down to resistance. Okay. And what we mean by reduced efficacy is when we do a fecal egg count reduction test, and that's one element where we should be using fecal egg counts is to test whether the wormers are working. So what you simply do is do a test at the time you're treating, and you do a test 14 days afterwards, or 7 days if it's levamisole, the yellow, and we look at the reduction in the egg count. And what we're looking for is the reduction in the egg count is to be 95% or better. If it's under 95%, then they're on this graph, okay? So you can see each of the bars. Now, what I would say that for each of the bars, there'll be some farms you've only dipped below the 95%, especially when it comes to talking about the orange wormer. But your 1BZ here is your white wormer, so that's the oldest group we've got. The majority of farms, it's rare to find a farm where white wormer works. It'll still work for nematodirus early in the season, but later on, it is rare to find farms where work. The second bar, but what's surprising though is the other wormers. Everybody's aware of white wormer resistance is quite widespread. What's been quite surprising to people is how much levamisole resistant, the yellow wormer, which is the second bar there, and even the clear wormers, ivermectin and moxidectin. So we've tested 2 in the 3 ml group, the clear wormers. So ivermectin is the short-acting version. Moxidectin is your longer-acting, so your sidectin type one. And we've seen this increase. The first time we found this in the UK was we found it in Wales in another project we did back in 2014-15, about 10 years. That's the first time it was really recorded. And we're now recording it in about 40% of farms. It's a bit worrying. And when we look as well, so we got Zolvix and Startect here. Now, we only tested Startect on 8 farms we've done this year because of the availability last year. Now you can see, just put that in an orange color because the Zolvix, that's only 4 farms. And for all of these, it's only just dipped below, well, the majority is only just dipped below the 95%. And we've got to be careful when we call that resistance when it's just starting. And I know one of the farms in this Zolvix group in particular, we've got a suspicious kind of over 1 result. But what I'll show you, so this is the results when we drop below 95%. I'm just going to overlay a graph over here, sort of another bar chart where we've got clear reduced efficacy. So this is where we've got efficacies below 80%. So this is below 80% is the time where it becomes a real problem for farms. So this is a time where we probably it's very likely to be resistance when it's below here, as long as the test is done correctly. And this is a full-blown reduction test where we've got a contractor goes out and weighs properly with a proper dosing and we know the job's been done correctly, and in the stringent LAMP protocol. So we're quite confident in the results, especially when below 80% is likely to be resistance. So you can see here Obviously, there's a, sort of the majority of farms, for the white wormer are, the efficacy is below 80%. We've got some which are 0% across the, sort of across all these four wormers, but you can see basically for the Zolvix one, or the orange group, the 4AD, there's nothing there that drops below the 80%. So that's encouraging. So if it is resistance, it's only the very start. So Zolvix still works on the vast majority of farms. Okay, there is evidence of some resistance, but we just to outline that. But you can see here, sort of what's interesting is the Levamisole one, it had a big drop off, from, the start of just a small amount of reduced efficacy to clear reduced efficacy that dropped off right off. But whereas the 3 ml group stayed quite high, especially the moxidectin. So we can see that, about 30% of farms, it was quite clear the lack of efficacy to that long-acting wormer. The concern with these wormer groups, this wormer group here, is the use of injectable products to control scab. So it's fairly widespread. So that means if we're buying stock in, buying rams or whatever, it's fairly there. And what I would say is that, yeah, and we did some more work in Sainsbury's, and the majority of farmers under that trial we did in 2017 were using wormers that weren't fully effective. And in terms of what we found when we talked to these farmers, the majority are unaware that they had, especially to these other 3 groups, to the clear wormers and the yellows. And a large percentage of them were resistant to 3 or 4 out of these 4 wormers we tested. Sort of, sort of 3 or 4, sort of, a lot of them had some level of resistance to them. Okay. And the estimated cost of that. So if you're using, we worked this out, sort of looking at various pieces of data. And various trials have been done. So if you're using an effective wormer versus an ineffective wormer, the difference in lamb value can be between £7 and £18. That difference can be made up of lots of different elements. Lots of lambs left later in the season when the price is dropping, lots of creep feed going into finished lambs, etc. So it is, when I talk about at the beginning, the bold statement of being a big issue for the industry, can be quite a significant cost to performance and to farms. And what I would say, the differences would be much more visible when we're 100% pasture reliant, as I said, because the feeding can mask it. So I'm going to question now, sort of basically for you to ponder. I'm not going to ask, I normally, if I'm in a room in a pub or somewhere with people, I'll ask people to give their opinion on this, but I'm not going to do that in a webinar like this. But this, I want to talk about, even if we didn't have any resistance, what is the, sort of the impact of worming and the impact of worms, etc. Now, what this is a very old graph from 1982 from the Modern, but this basically simply shows us the effect of different levels of parasite challenge on weight gain. So you've got time after infection with parasites at the beginning here, and weight gain here. Now, these were lambs that were housed back in the 80s. They were hill lambs that were housed, and they were artificially given larvae from worms. So they were dosed with larvae every single day at different levels, okay, to mimic what those sheep would be picking up if they were grazing pasture and picking up larvae, okay? So about 3,000 to 5,000 larvae a day would be typical of what we'd find on a Welsh West Wales farm, which is fairly sheep heavy, sheep sick farm, where we've got sheep on sheep and sheep, would be typical of the kind of larvae intake we might get in every day, sort of with there. So you can see the lambs that didn't have any challenge grew 14 kilos in that time. And obviously, the higher the challenge we gave those lambs, the lower the weight gain was. And you can see here the weight gain drops off to about kind of half. Okay, so we know this. This is why we worm. This is why we worm animals. They do have an effect on live weight. So a question I want you to ponder is, if we had this line here, so they're on a heavy worm infection, and if you look back at this summer, it's been an ideal season for worms and parasites. If you were worming every 3 weeks with a fully effective wormer, where would you like the performance of these lambs to be? So we're going to worm these every 21 days on the dot with a wormer with no resistance, not a long-acting wormer, but okay, sort of where would we hope that to be? Now, I'm assuming, judging by answers I get when I'm talking in pubs to people, is that people would like the growth rate here to move from here up closer to the blue line. Some say they like it on the blue line, really, if they believe the people that sell them are wormers, or certainly to be fairly close to there. But when we look at the reality, when we've got a high challenge and when we're worming all the time, every 21 days on the dot with a fully effective wormer, we only get this lift. We do get a lift, we get a kilo or 2 lift, but it's nowhere near if these lambs are on no challenge. And what's really interesting, it's nowhere near even if they're on a lowish challenge and a nice low challenge. These lambs on a low challenge are doing better than the high challenge one, being cleared out of wormers all the time. So, it's a bit of a puzzle from when I present this. Is a puzzle for the majority of people. Wow, that's a bit weird. And the reason for this effect is that, well, there's potentially multiple reasons. One of them could be, the larvae do damage, and once the guts have damage, it's difficult to repair, and you've affected that animal's ability to convert the feed into the nutrients it needs to grow and to be absorbed, etc. But the other effect is, it's the everyday thing. So these were given larvae every day as if they were grazing. And when you worm animals with a short-acting wormer, that wormer will be in the body for a day or 2 days, maybe 3 days at a push. So that's all you're doing is wiping out all the worms that's inside the body at that point. When you turn them back out to the pasture, they are picking up worms again. So they are ingesting worms again. So that means those worms do damage as soon as they go over the tongue, and that means they are causing growth rate issues. Okay, so yeah, sort of even the interval between worming, when the larvae go in, there's no adults there, but they will cause issues, loss of appetite, etc. So yeah, so my question, even if there's no resistance, is worming the best answer anyway, actually? And for me, avoiding or reducing a larvae challenge is more beneficial than grazing animals on a high challenge and treating on a regular basis with wormers. So for me, we need to evolve our mindset, and I think you'll be champions of this and at the forefront of this as Pasture for Life members. We need to go away from this historic kind of thought process of accepting we've just got a huge worm burden and blitzing them, filling the shotgun with everything we have and blitzing them with chemicals. We need to evolve that to thinking more about, can we manage farms to try and reduce that challenge in the first place? So rather than treating, avoid. So this is what we're trying to avoid. This is a blade of grass. You can see a picture here with all the larvae and that drop of dew underneath it. So when the sheep come along and eat that, that's how they get infected. So how can we get less of them? The damage occurs as soon as they go into the body. There's lots of different things we can do. I'm not going to dwell in detail on the majority of these. But those larvae, reducing egg output. So those larvae come out of eggs. So actually, targeted worming does have a place here, like I mentioned earlier. We worm at the right time when there's a burden and there's eggs being deposited. We are reducing the egg output. We're reducing the challenge for later on. So that's one of the reasons why we will be worming. And there's the breeding for resistance under here as well. This is linked to reduced egg output. There's a number of breeders out there. We're doing a lot of work in our lab in Aberystwyth at the moment for the clean breeding group, performance breeding group, for Exlanas, for some Romney breeders, and Innovis as a breeding company. These are kind of different breed groups who are putting resistance against parasites as one of their metrics, and we're doing that on the back of fecal egg counts. And that's mean animals which are bred for resistance will generally have lower egg output, so they'll cope with the worms better and chuck less eggs out there. Safer pastures, so cross-grazing with a different species, cattle versus sheep, etc. Putting more chicory planting, some of these herbal lays in, more clover in a pasture as well. Contamination mapping as well is knowing where contamination is, and we're using fecal egg counts like that a lot to know when we're doing fecal egg counts. So if we can know where our hotspots are, we can avoid those with our young stock, etc. But using tech and data, which we're going to come into, for me, monitoring is the key to all of this, basically. So to try and achieve these things, we need to, we're trying different things. We need to know whether they are actually working or not, etc. Then monitoring to see what works and what not. So how can we use technology and data reviewment? And I'm sure many of you, we're probably using some of these. I'm sure many of you are using fecal egg counts. I'll talk about the regular monitoring, but for me, to monitor, try and manage the situation, you've got to monitor it, and there's different things we look at. We look at growth rates. It's not just the fecal egg counts. We look at growth rates, body condition scores, etc. Part of the data we get is our historic, our shepherding skills and our stockman skills, looking at the clinical signs, but also fecal egg counts come into that. Obviously, I'm going to dwell a lot on the fecal egg count element. So just a quick, fecal egg counts, just to give a reminder to everybody about fecal egg counts. I just use the words, they're a guide to the level of parasitism, okay? It's an indicator to what's happening. It's not perfect, okay? Because it's not as good as killing the animals and counting how many worms is inside there, but that's not very useful for management. And just that picture here, this is a picture we have of our devices this is a super high one. There's a lot of eggs you can see here, nematodes and strongyles in there, okay? So what this picture does, that gives you an EPG answer, an eggs per gram answer, and that gives you a little bit more data and information to help you make a decision whether we should treat or not, okay? It'll also help you to decide when to treat, what to treat, but also we can use it to see if our treatments worked, as I discussed when we test for resistance. So I think it's important to remember that it's got its limitations. We only detect eggs, which are coming from adults. Okay, so they're going to be laying eggs, and there'll be inherent natural variation in the test that we do as well. Okay, so when it comes to monitoring parasites and doing monitoring, I come a lot of farms, and I speak to vets and farmers and oh yeah, our clients are doing a good job, we'll do. And when I look into it, there's only doing 2 or 3 tests a year, etc. For me, 2 or 3 tests a year is not monitoring, so we need to be doing this on a regular basis. Bit of a weird thing for me to say when there's somebody selling fecal egg count tests, but the results you get, about half of them probably isn't going to change that much for you or mean that much. So you quite often do a test. You might think, oh, I think they need worming. They look a bit wormy, whatever, and the egg count might come back as quite high. And you go, oh, see, I told you. What did I bother testing for? And vice versa, you might think they look clean and healthy, and yeah, the egg count backs that up, etc. But there will be ones which are more enlightening, which kind of does catch you out, and we can't tell you which ones will be the enlightening ones. So the issue is only doing it occasionally in a year. If you're doing it at times, you're not going to catch when it's going to be more enlightening, and we get surprises. And quite often, sometimes it gives us just a peace of mind, confirms our actions are correct. But we do it on a regular basis. That's when we will change our patterns of what's happening. So for me, it's more about, rather than one-off kind of tests because of the limitations, it's about tracking trends. So I was just talking to a farmer yesterday, actually. We're working with them on a project. We've had a bunch of lambs which have been haven't been wormed for 8 weeks now, probably. And they're just slowly starting to climb. And we've been watching them climb for the last kind of 3 occasions every 2 weeks, whatever. And now they're climbing. They haven't gone sky high yet, but because they're still on the climb, we're tracking a trend. Actually, we're going to go in and worm them now. So it's more about tracking trends sometimes on that regular basis. And what do we mean by regular monitoring? So this is an example of one of our farms, Clare Wise, up in the north of England. Our top 10 farm users, that's how many tests a year they're doing. So this is our guys using our kit on farm. I'll talk about our lab service as well. So yeah, you can see there our top users are doing a lot of testing. The top one here has to do a lot because they've got multiple wormer resistance issues. Not a single wormer works. They've got homunculus issues. So they're in a bit of a pickle on a lot of sheep as well. But these are our top 10, and there's a couple of fanatics in there probably. Some of them might be in this call actually, but our clients doing testing on farm on average will do about 5 samples a month from the peak grazing system. So majority of users will do between 20 and 50 tests a year. So when we've got running about 300-400 sheep or whatever, for me, we need to be looking at 30-40 tests. And why I say that, because quite often if we don't do enough regular, what we find quite often is the interval between testing is quite often too long. So if we decide on the back of a fecal egg count and how they look not to treat animals, then there is a bit of a habit we don't retest for another month and we forget about them for a month. And the issue for that, when we look at the life cycle, so this is the life cycle of the worms. I'm not going to go into details, but you got your larvae going off the pasture into the guts here. They get eaten. Those grow into adults and they then lay eggs, and those eggs hatch. But this bit here that I'm interested in now, once the larvae go into the stomach, it takes about 3 weeks for those to grow and to mate and produce eggs again, okay? So when we're doing an egg count, we're only picking up these egg-laying adults, as I said, so we're only picking up the eggs here, okay? So if you give you a scenario, if you turned a bunch of lambs into a heavily contaminated field 2 weeks ago, and they might be struggling a bit, and there's a lot of larvae challenge there, we could do a test on that today, and we could have a 0 or a very low egg count. but there might be a lot of juvenile developing worms inside there. Okay. Now they might not be suffering, they might be okay at the moment, and etc. Now, if you leave them for a month and it was a high challenge, that extra month has been a long time with quite a big challenge inside those lambs, which has gone unchecked. So if you tested those lambs in a week's 10 days time, given the life cycle a chance to get to 3 weeks where there's eggs coming out, we can see fecal egg counts change rapidly sometimes from a very low zero. They can jump up to the thousands or whatever, when we have that kind of scenario. And this is what I see happening quite often, especially in seasons which are like we've had this summer, wet, warm, it's been a horrible, well, we haven't had a summer really, even we, but we should be testing, for me, 10 to 14 days later for lambs. Similar for maybe a little bit longer for calves, but your young stock, vulnerable young stock out there grazing, we should test. If you decided not to worm, we should be testing again fairly regularly. And this is the mistake a lot of people do when people get unstuck and don't believe in it. There are occasions where we wouldn't wait for fecal egg counts to rise as well. So we got nematodirus early in the season for your young lambs in April, May. And after a drought breaks, if we get a drought again in the UK, sort of nice to have one after last year. But sometimes when we got a drought period, what happens in a drought period is there's a buildup of eggs in the dung, in dry kind of pats and dry clumps of dung on the pasture. And what happens when the drought breaks, the moisture comes, there's been a buildup of these eggs over the time. All the eggs hatch at the same time. There's a mass hatch of eggs. The lambs will go from not being exposed to hardly any worms to a lot. And sometimes we can see that being quite a big challenge for them. And they can have issues before they've got to that adult stage and laying eggs. So we might go in sometimes knowing the conditions, etc. Sort of, you're going to be a bit careful about how we interpret them sometimes, okay? But it is a sort of indication. My other kind of bugbear is quite often is about not sampling different groups on the farm. So this is one of our project farms we worked with in Sainsbury's a few years ago, and this was typical of what he'd have. This is a map of the farm, and we had 4 different lambs group at the time of testing, grazing 4 different parts of the farm, different numbers of lambs in each group. What tends to happen if we're sending a sample into a vet or into a lab, or we're testing ourselves, quite often we find we'll test one group of lambs, we'll take a sample from one group of lambs, and we make a decision for all groups of lambs on the farm based on that one test. Now that result, in this instance, came back at 280 eggs per gram, which is fairly low. 500 is our cutoff, 500 to 700-ish is our cutoff. So 500, and it's below that 500. The lamb's looking okay. We probably decide not to worm. But under this scenario, based on that result, we're not worming anything. When we look at each group independently, we can see a massive variation between groups, and we commonly see this. You can see here the top group and the group A and group C, we've got quite a high challenge here and a higher one there. This was just a scenario we did have on one of the farms, and these two are much lower. So if you happen to test a low one, you're going to maybe miss worming. So yeah, the full picture is a very different story. The 2 groups that needed worming and needed help weren't done, and we might have poor performance, and then farmers that don't believe in testing, okay? We see this all the time. Your paddocks or your fields on the farm will be very different in terms of worm challenge, depending on what was grazing there previously, whether, how high they are, whether they're north-facing, south-facing, etc. There's probably just as much variability between groups of stock on a farm as there is between farms, if I was honest with you. So for me, the testing needs to be within reason, each group of young stock, lambs, kind of whatever, separately. Winter worm issues. We're coming into the winter, just keeping an eye on time here. Winter worm issues, unexpected burdens. We quite often find unexpected burdens in our winter. This year, now this is a bit older. This is from our Sainsbury's project we did a few years ago. This is 2015, but we see this. This was quite a nice kind of obvious one, but what this shows you here is, if you look at the blue line, this is our average fecal egg counts per month for lambs, okay? And this goes from May till January, okay? So you can see the end part of the graph is November, December, January, and what you'll see here, the highest counts we had in 2015 was November, December, January, not in the middle of summer where we're worming all the time. And we've switched a lot of people from worming regularly in the summer. Sometimes in the winter, we need to do a couple of other wormers. We know our environment is changing, our climate's changing, whether we like it or not. we can see, well, it's a bit colder here in Wales today, but the last 10 days or whatever, it's been exceptionally mild for November. We don't seem to get the prolonged hard winters we used to get. We're getting less of them, etc. So the effect of that is that these worms, the dynamics of the worms and the pastures are changing. They're affecting our stock at times we didn't expect. So for me, don't think that we're getting into shorter days in the winter coming, that worms have gone away. Keep testing. So anybody with ewe lamb replacements on the farm, any store lambs that haven't been finished yet, that you're trying to finish on pasture. I know a lot of folk would be outwintering young stock as well. And even if they're grazing crops, grazing fodder beet or, kale or whatever, etc., we can have surprises there as well. They should have a lot less worms there. But, if you've got a runoff for them in terms of a bit of grass or a bit of grass verges, side of hedges or whatever, sometimes they'll have, especially when they're transitioning to crop, they'll heavily graze those areas and they can still get a worm burden. So that's a message from me is, don't ignore testing through the winter months, even for worms in your young stock. Very quickly around ewes, around lambing time, because I'm not going to dwell on this because we are doing another webinar in March. I've got another slide on this where we're going to be covering this in more detail. Okay, so we can still we'll be using fecal egg count on ewes. I'm going to talk in more detail about this project we did. But I just wanted to touch on it very quickly because some of you might be lambing a bit earlier, or we're certainly preparing for lambing before we get to that stage. So, there is, it's a time of year where we normally would worm. There's scope to massively reduce the worm issues at that point, or certainly change the timing of it. And the things that we think about before, the effect of nutrition and having animals in good body condition is massive. So it will have a massive bearing on the immune system and how well they cope. So if they're well nourished and whatever, so you might be surprised they're doing a good job of that immunity themselves. So for me, before that March webinar, we should be thinking about testing maybe around housing, pre-lambing period. You can start testing to see what's going on and looking at different groups of what's happening. Okay, but as I said, we're going to touch more on that in March when we come into it. Very quickly, just a couple of slides on cattle very quickly before I go on to fluke for the last 15 minutes or so. Very similar message sort of on cattle. For us, we did a project here. If you look at the EIP Wales projects, you can look at the improving diagnosis and this. We've done less work in cattle than we have in sheep. Thresholds are much lower, so we need a more sensitive test. But here, the biggest problem here is the 3 ml wormers because of the high reliance we've had on injectable and porons. And the efficacy issues we have is probably more so with our 3 ml wormers, our ivermectins and the sidectins. So, so there's definitely issues there. We can still use it. The one word of warning just on the fecal egg counting for cattle, it won't pick up lungworm. So we're going to be careful of lungworm, and it might need, chat to the vet and signs of that, etc. I'm not going to dwell too long on this, but this just shows that no two farms. So this is 2 farm set of data, and this is the average fecal egg count over a 3-year period. These are very similar farms in West Wales. It just shows the difference, but if I had time to show it in more detail, it shows the difference in egg counts between seasons and between years as well, and there's massive difference. But the other difference I'm trying to show here as well is the low the low fecal egg count we found in the second season grazers. So the green dots are the second season grazers, our second year cattle, etc. So that's all I want to talk about cattle quickly. Fluke is very topical, so I've got a couple of quick slides on Fluke before I talk about our services and what we can offer you. So our Fluke test, Fluke testing, wintertime is an ideal time for Fluke, and it is predicted we're going to have a bit more Fluke around, not everywhere maybe, but we are predicting a bit more Fluke around. We've seen a lot less Fluke in the last probably 10 years than we have previous to that, but this year with the conditions that we are predicted to be. So for us, it's about proactive testing, trying to get the flukicide treatment correct. What we sell is a Fluke egg test. So we're an egg test. Okay, so we'll detect adult flukes as well. And just to explain that a bit, there's a bit of confusion sometimes around the diagnostic tests out there for fluke. There's different diagnostic tests that we can do, ways of diagnosing it. This is off a poster that's produced by Scops and Cows. If you go onto the Scops and Cows website, you'll find this poster. But basically, you've got 4 different tests. And this graph at the top here is slightly off. It's gone slightly off the thing, but this shows the weeks after infection. Okay, so as you know, the life cycle of the fluke, when they pick up the juvenile fluke off the pastures, it takes 10 to 12 weeks for them to produce eggs. Okay, so for a fluke egg count, we don't detect it until after this 10-week period. Around the 10 to 12-week period is when a fluke egg count will pick it. So that's one of the drawbacks. So this talks about each test and the drawbacks and the values of them. Each have different values and each have different drawbacks. Okay, so one of the drawbacks of our test, you don't pick it up until a bit later, but now onwards, we're more likely to see adults. This is the time we look at using it. Okay. You've also got one that there's another kind of fecal test we do called copper antigen. Now, we don't do that. Your vet might be able to arrange that. That's the advantage. It'll do it. It will start picking up a couple of weeks sooner than fluke egg counts. Okay. And you look at this copper antigen ELISA test here. So the issue here with the copper antigen test is lower sensitivity in cattle and also in pool samples. So you shouldn't really be using pools. It says here, avoid using pool samples. So if you've got large numbers of animals running in mobs, you should be doing individual sentinels in that, and we should be looking at 10 individuals. And then, the cost, builds up a little bit then. So it's not a great test for pooled, whereas a fluke egg count can be done in pooled, which it means is a bit of a cheaper diagnostic test, but you're going to be aware it's going to pick it up a little bit later on in that cycle. Okay, each have got their place, as I said. There's a new blood antibody ELISA test, and there's a new one launched just recently. So just now we can get through a bit. So the blood antibody ELISA is quite exciting because it picks it up quite early on. And this is a fantastic test, but only for your young animals. This can really be used for first season grazing animals. So your lambs or calves coming into late summer, into the autumn, it's a fantastic test to do on them to see when are they first getting exposed. The issue with the antibody test is you can still have antibodies circulating for a long time after even a fluke infection has been cleared. So in adults, it's not going to be effective because a positive test might be a fluke infection that was cleared 6 months ago or even longer. That might have been treated and cleared. So it'll still give you positive. So that's the drawback of the antibody test. You can't use it in older animals. So older animals, you'd go for the copper antigen or fluke egg counts. Younger animals, you wouldn't use these younger in the early in season. That is the test to go for. There's also the post-mortem analysis fallen stock. That's really good indicator to what's on your farm as well, if you get kind of abattoir data back as well. And just talk about the guides to the testing and when we'd use different tests in terms of the seasonality for fluke. So yeah, you're looking at late summer, autumn, as I said here, in the young animals, you do the antibody testing, etc., late summer into the autumn. Once it gets a bit, when you're looking at the acute disease period, if it's identified, we can then start looking later in the autumn, starting using some of the fecal tests like the fluke egg counts that we have. When we get later into the autumn and certainly into the winter and spring, early summer, when we get into the chronic period, that's where the fecal testing comes in. Fluke egg counts, individual and composite, and what we do say, we're negative, repeat test in 4 to 8 weeks. If we have a negative test in the fecals, it is important to back it up with another. See this negative loop around here, we should back it up with another negative, because just in case we're a bidder, because sometimes, I know last year the fluke season was really, really late, so we weren't getting positive eggs until quite middle of winter and onwards. So if you're testing early in the winter, you're going to miss it. Okay, and again, that poster's there, it's on the scopes. I'm not going to dwell more on that, but just talks about the different periods you'd use the different tests. But certainly now for us, our egg count from the this late autumn period now through to the winter is when we'd look at that for our egg count. What we do report, we'll report liver and rumen fluke presence. However, I want to really reiterate, liver fluke is the real key one. That's the main species of interest. Rumen fluke, there's a very, we're still trying to understand a lot about rumen fluke and the effects it has. There's lots of anecdotal evidence, but it's very sporadic in terms of how, does it affect animals? We will report it, but I'll come to that about how we interpret it. So it's a liver fluke target test for me. As I said, it only picks up the adults, so that they have to be there for above 10 weeks or more after they're first infected. So we test on the adult stock classes or lambs or calves once they get above 6 months of age later in the season. And then, yeah, late autumn, winter, you test on that late autumn, winter period to see if any fluke picked up in the summer period that needs treating. So it'll be typical done around now housing, scanning time for ewes, etc. Would be a good time to do a fluke egg test. You'd also use it later on in the season, spring to early summer. We might discuss that in the next webinar, where you're looking for contamination of the snail habitats. Anybody with dairy cattle as well, anybody, and it's during the drying off period is where we look at that anyway. Sort of because you can't treat with flukicides when they're lactating. So when we come to interpreting fluke egg counts, I just wanted to touch on it because it is quite important how that's all we give you. For the fecal egg counts, for the gastrointestinal worms, we'll give you a count. But for the liver fluke, the fluke test, we only give you detected or not detected, if they're there or not, okay? Because there's ambiguity about the numbers. And remembering it's only adult fluke. And what we do say strongly for us, if liver fluke is not detected, okay, we say 2 to 3 weeks, so anything from 2 to 8 weeks, especially if you're in a fluke high challenge area, a high risk area for fluke, and especially if you're in a time of year where you expect to see fluke, like now in the winter time for us in West Wales and the west coast of Scotland, in Ireland especially, then I would really back up a negative test with another one. Don't rely on one. There's the sporadic nature of how they chuck eggs out, okay? So if I have two negative tests a good few weeks apart, I am fairly confident there's not many adult fluke there that's affecting them, okay? Rumen fluke, if you see positives, don't worry about it. Very understudied parasite, lots of debate, as I said. And the number of eggs are sometimes huge and it doesn't mean anything, okay? We've seen huge egg counts and the stock are performing really well. So don't get too excited. If you are concerned and you're concerned about performance, speak to your vet about it. There is anecdotal evidence that they can cause issues, but don't get too excited. So very quickly, just going to talk about our tests and the quick plug in the last kind of 5 minutes. I'm running close to 8 o'clock, Kate, I know, but just in the last few minutes, just to give you a quick overview of what we can offer in terms of testing, because we're encouraging testing. I'm assuming a lot of you are testing already. Some of you might be using, and recognize a couple of names here, who are using our kits. So we've got a couple of options. This is our option enabling technology where we can do the test on farm. So this is our imaging device where software kind of enabled, cloud connected, where we upload images of samples up to the cloud. We get results back within 20 minutes if it's within our office hours, but we do an evening and a weekend service as well. And we are very close. Artificial intelligence is working on the images. We currently still have technicians who check the images before results go out. However, the AI is getting better and better, and we're not far off being able to release AI, which will mean when AI is released fully, we'll be sending results out pretty much immediately. Go up to the cloud, a matter of minutes, you'll have results back. The advantage of doing it on farm tends to be, as you saw on that slide, people will test more often if they don't have to post samples away and get it off farm, etc., etc. But it's not for everybody, okay? Fairly simple to use, but it's not for everybody. But the discount the offer we've got with the Pasture for Life members, there's 10% off these kits as well. Anybody interested in this, come and speak to us, about, how this works, more detail about it, etc. But, maybe not for everybody, for smaller farms, etc., or anybody not, tech savvy and wanting to use tech or whatever. We have got our postal service, and there's also the 10% discount off these. So it's FECPAK accredited, our lab in Aberystwyth, and yeah, quick results, etc. And we got our FEC test kit, just for the simple gastrointestinal ones. We got our fluke egg test kit, as I discussed. And obviously it's fluke season now, even though, we should be looking at eggs now in those young stock as well. But definitely from now onwards is a real peak time. We're definitely seeing a lot more fluke samples coming through the lab now. And we got the dual test as well. So the dual test is when, for the occasions, for the samples, you want to get a FEC and a fluke when on the same sample. This won't be always. There'll be times where in young animals before, early autumn and summer, young animals, we wouldn't do a fluke test, so it's only the FEC. And tends to be looking at cattle, you'd only, adult cattle, for example, we shouldn't need to do a fecal egg count on them, it's only a fluke we'd do. So maybe later on when it comes around that scanning housing time for sheep, potentially, might be a good time. You might want to do a fluke and a fecal egg count together. So it's a bit cheaper to do two tests together there. And very quickly, in terms of how our submission works, so you'll buy these kits. I'll talk to you about where you can buy them, from our FECPAK shop. You follow the instructions. So on the outside of these boxes, you'll see a QR code there as well. There's a QR code there. There's also instructions inside the boxes of how to use the kit. But there's clear videos, instructions of how to collect samples. And we are quite stringent on that because how we collect the samples has a massive bearing on the accuracy of results, and doing that collection correctly is really, really important. We've then got a QR submission. So we've got a QR code label that goes on there. So we're trying to do our submission online. So when we're doing the submission, we still want your name and phone number on the label, but if you scan the QR code, first time you use it, it'll ask you to register an account like normal accounts. and then you put details about the animals on there. So there's a couple of elements why we do this QR submission. It means we don't have untidy, messy forms coming to the lab, which is smeared in fecal material, and we can't understand the writing. Sort of that's one thing, but it also simplifies it as we just scan that code in the bag, and all the information you've input comes up, and it's there, that information about the animals. So we ask about, when they were collected, what mob name, when they were treated, all these kind of things. You put them into the prepaid postage box and post them back to us. We get them in the lab, and they arrive in our lab probably mid-late morning, and we turn the results around in within a few hours of arriving. So we have been commended about how quick we are in getting results out once they arrive in the lab. So we email those results out to you as well. So this online process allows us to track as well, because we are reliant on the postage here, whatever. So it allows us to track what's happening as well. And we know as well what samples are on the way into us. So it does work quite nicely. It's a new thing we launched in the last kind of 12 months. And yeah, it is quite a liked kind of system where we can do this kind of online connectivity. So a bit different than just filling a form and sending a sample in. And in terms of when we're posting them as well, we are reliant on the Royal Mail, but certainly don't post them in our rural post boxes. Take them to a village post boxes somewhere we know is going to be collected, or hand them to the postie when they come to the yard. Don't post on Friday, early in the week, and the better. But if they get posted and somewhere's going to be collected, they've got a lot better in the last 5-6 months. We generally get them next day. So in terms of where to buy these, we got some retailers who stock them, but for the discount, you can buy them from our FEC shop. You can scan the QR code there if you'd like, and we'll circulate this maybe tomorrow. I'll talk to Bryony and Kate tomorrow, but we'll circulate these again about the details. We can get them from the shop. We go onto our online shopping and buy them there, etc. And in terms of the cost, there's a 10% discount off these prices for you guys. But you can see a single test will be £16 for a FEC, £25 for fluke, and £35 for the dual. And if you're buying 5 or more and on an order, then it's £2 cheaper per test if you're buying 5 or more on the order, okay? And you get 10% off, and even the bundle is there, okay? That's exclusive of that, so there'll be VAT on top of these, and it's about £1.99 per order for postage and packaging. And when you buy that, you get these packs coming out. You get the test kit box, the scoop, and the bag, a leak-proof bag, everything you need to collect the sample and the instructions, and also the prepaid postage. So that pays for the postage back to the lab, and it pays for the lab analysis as well. Okay, so you pay for everything when you order, and you could order some of these ready in the season. So you can order 5+ tests or whatever. You don't have to use them straight away. You could buy a pack of 10 now and use them through the next 3 or 4 months or into the summer if you want. Okay. And in terms of the exclusive offer, when you go onto there, now we'll circulate this to all the members. I'm aware that there's some non-members on here, so we haven't shown you the code. That's the advantage of becoming a member. You do get nice discounts like this. But we will share the code with you, and there'll be a place where you can put a discount code into our Shopify FECPAK shop page, and you can put that code in. So that code will be circulated after the meeting. Yeah, you'll get your 10% off those test kits. That'll be off those test kits. It's also, that 10% is also off our system you might want on farm, and the first year annual subs. Okay. So it'll account to us if you want the kit on farm, and that's quite a bit more cost to that. So it's quite a hefty discount, and it's open until the end of May. Okay, so that discount is open and offered to the end of May. So stock up before then, would be my message. So that's a bit of what we're trying to do. That's kind of in terms of promotion and sort of and coming in front of you here this evening. Yeah, so thanks for listening. I know we've run over time of 4 minutes. Sorry, Kate, but we're maybe a few minutes late starting. But yeah, those are my key take homes. Testing should be regular, good collection, and using data to try and help what we're trying to do to maintain good production, but reduce reliance on wormers as well. So yeah, some of my key take homes here, and then yeah, just finish off on another slide before we open up for questions. Just reminder of our webinar. Maybe Kate will remind you of this anyway. We got 13th of March, I think it is. I think I got the date right, where we're talking more specifically around challenges going into the spring, user on lambing time, thinking about cattle, turnout on outwintered stock, etc. And yeah, anybody wants more details, especially if you want to talk to us about the on-farm kits, etc., get in touch with us. Perry's not able to join us this evening. He was hoping to join us, but he's not been able to make it. But Perry's our man. He's based up in Scotland, but he's probably covering sales, fairly widespread for us now anyway. So he's covering our sales and relationship management. So Perry can, or myself can speak to you about the kits and the details there. We'll circulate these as well afterwards. So yeah, thank you very much. I've been grabbing on now for an hour, so hopefully I haven't. You're still here, which is quite amazing. Majority of you anyway. So open it up to questions.
Thank you so much. You definitely can possibly accept your apology in the engaging talk. Yeah, an incredible amount of knowledge that you shared with us. Thank you so much. We'll open up to questions though. Does anyone have any questions? You're welcome to just unmute and speak up, or if you're inclined to speak up in front of the group, then feel free to put them in the chat and I'll read them out.
I think your audio, we could just about hear you. Your signal wasn't too great there for a bit. It was a bit crackly, but I think we generally heard you. Sort of. So I think you were saying to unmute your audio and ask any questions. I think I could see one question from Richard in the chat there. And do deer carry the same worms as sheep? Oh, that's a testing one. I think that there is some crossover. There are some that are specific to deer, and I need to look this up actually, sort of a bit more detail. So we do have some worms which will be specific to deer, and sheep and goats definitely cross over. Okay, I sort of know that much, but I think the majority of the deer ones are fairly specific to deer systems, and yeah. So I'm trying to remember back now because I had this conversation about 18 months ago. We got a couple of clients who do actually quite a lot of deer testing. And I'm trying to remember now. It's caught me a little bit off guard. Yeah. So yeah, what we can do, Richard, yeah, sort of maybe if Brian or Kate makes a note of the name, I will dig that out for you. So if there's an interest, and I will share that with you properly when I look up my textbook. So we got Kit. When collecting pool samples, are you better to collect one large sample or a couple of smaller pool samples per group? The perfect world, you could get a couple of smaller pool samples per group and test them separately, okay? However, the time that you take doing that, you take longer doing that. And obviously, if we we're paying £16 a test or £14 if you're buying multiples for us, etc. Sort of it gets a bit more expensive. So that would give you, a better indication of the variability within a group. For me, yeah. And if you could look, I know some people would look at the top end of lambs and the bottom end of lambs, or they look at sometimes the scoury lambs versus the non-scoury lambs, for example. And you can, yeah, absolutely, you can do that and you can see variation. For me, it's probably more important to collect a really good pool sample which is representative for the group. So we're in our pool samples instructions, especially when we've got a large number of animals within a management group. So we were running 200 or 300 lambs together, for example, or sort of, it's more important to have between 15 to 25 different samples collected into the same bag. So we're collecting ones, but we go more than 10. So getting enough animals into the one mob probably gives you an indication, because I think if you collect different pool samples from different, from sub mobs within the mob, are you going to mark them and treat them differently anyway? You're probably not. Because we know, if you do one good pool sample, get enough representatives, you're going to have an average egg count. We know from all the work we've done, when you've got an average egg count, the variability between individuals that make it that pool is going to be quite big. That's why we do the breeding for resistance work. So we're doing analysis now for clients who are doing that breeding for resistance work, and we'll see variability from between we'll have an average egg count of 600 eggs per gram, for example. We'll have some lambs at 0 and some lambs at 2,000 or 3,000 eggs per gram. Okay, there'll be huge variability. So what we know is, even when we've got an average egg count of, let's say, 600 or 700, we can go in and treat. We don't have to treat everything, and we can just use our eye. The ones that are looking in better condition, if you're measuring growth rates, that's perfect. And there's a lot of combination we can do with looking at growth rates with this as well. Looking at growth rate data. If they're still growing, then, we can leave them unwormed and we look at the poorer ones, the ones that haven't met the growth rate threshold or whatever. Good. Got more questions? Oh, sorry, I need to scroll down there. Yeah, shall I read it out? Yeah, sort of, we can see questions there. Maybe Kate's kind of things aren't maybe quite working, and see in the chat there as well. So from John Thorns, as pasture for life farmers, how can we manage our pasture better to reduce worms, e.g., long rest periods and standing hay, etc. Yep, those are two examples. Trying to put longer rest periods in your rotations is really is beneficial to worms. As with all things with management, it's balancing it out with production as well, and making sure we've got an efficient system and we've got our stocking rates are sustainable to ours. In a perfect world, we could have really cut down on stocking rates, which allows us to give those longer rest periods, etc. But then do you lose out on the quality of the pasture that you're grazing then, etc.? So this is part of the balancing act we've got to do with pasture quality, for example, okay? But longer rest periods, how long a rest period you need to get rid of worms totally. So when we're talking about resistant farms, get rid of worms totally, worms can survive as eggs or even as larvae when they're in the L3 larvae stage. They can survive for up to 2 years. Okay, but a lot of them will have died off in a few months. Depends on the conditions. A lot of worms will die off. So you have even resting for a 2 month period or whatever, if the conditions are right, we'll have a lot of larvae kill off potentially. But things you can do if you've got the option of cattle versus sheep, for example, cattle and sheep cross grazing. So if you can alternately graze between cattle and sheep, that's fantastic. Um, there's lots of other tools as well. So the other bit is, yeah, making your crops as well. Yeah, that standing hay, sort of standing hay, or even making hay silage or whatever. That's a bit of a resting period, and you'll be picking up some of those worms on the pasture. There'll still be plenty of worms left, but it'll be a little bit of a safer pasture than your kind of continuously grazed pasture, your grazing pastures. So they help. For me, I think a big impact, we're seeing that is the advent of a bit more of a mixed sward in there. The days of having these kind of single species kind of ryegrass swords. The worms really love those ryegrass plants to be able to crawl onto the leaves. So like I mentioned, chicory, the herbal lays, etc. We can put more of those things. Even some of the older pastures we have, like the timothies and the cocksfoots, the structure of the plants, we will find a bit less worms on them. And clover is fantastic. Lots of clover in your pastures is really good. Not only does it, some of those plants, they got multiple benefits. The structure of the plant and the way they grow means the larvae find it more difficult to get onto the plant. So when they get ingested. The other thing is the protein content and the mineral content help boost immune systems, and also in some of those plants you'll have tannins which also affect the establishment of worms inside the gut. So that will help reduce it. Sort of reducing worms as well. The other something came into my brain there and it kind of flew out again. Just in terms of doing good rotational grazing and good practice rotational grazing, generally, if you've got a rotation, if you've got a 30-day rotation, for example, generally you're back in the pasture at the kind of time, if the conditions are right, where a lot of the eggs that were dumped there previously would have hatched anyway, and there'd be a lot of eggs there. So, but for me, I think the big benefit, if you're doing rotational grazing correctly, if we're turning out of a pasture and leaving a good residue, so we're not grazing much more below 1,500 kilograms dry matter a hectare, whatever, we're turning them out before we've grazed right down to the floor. That will help because a lot of the worms will live in the bottom couple of centimeters of the sward. So if we're not forcing them to graze right down into the bottom of the sward, that will help reduce the uptake of worms as well. So that's where I think rotational grazing would help a little bit as well, okay? Yeah, so I think that there's quite a few things in there, etc. But a lot of the things I will just touch on that as well. A lot of the things I talk about, like these management systems, can we make 2 crops of hay on it, in a season to reduce? It's difficult to do that over all your farm. So if you, as part of what we do with fecal egg counts, we can record what field we're getting the egg counts in. We can start building up a pattern of where the hot spots for worms are on the farm, because as I showed on that map, there'll be different pastures will have different worm challenges. So partly for me is contamination mapping, spotting where you've got your wormy pastures, and we just try and do those management activities on those pastures, on those fields alone, because it's impossible to do it across all the farm. So can we target, those worm hotspots and about spotting it as well? So,
Eurion, thank you so much. The
yeah,
questions are coming in thick and fast now. I'll let you
good.
carry on reading from the chat if you're happy to.
There we are. That's fine. Yeah. So it's thinking about So Richard's thinking about wild deer, which are rather a lot spreading worms. Yeah, and as we know, they can spread rather a lot of other things as well. So yeah, I will come back to you on that. I don't think they're a massive spreader. I need to look in to what can spread, and we'll come back to you. How long do the wormer chemicals last in the dung, killing dung beetles? I should know this because I went to the dung beetle conference back in the summer. I do know there was work done by Bryony Sands, and she's Bristol, but also she's in the States now. And they looked at the effect of worming and the dung going into kind of manure heaps or whatever, or into slurry pits or whatever. And a lot of the ivermectin effect, even after a long storage in a slurry pit, a lot of the ivermectin was still there. So they can last so they can last in the dung for a fairly long while, and in the soil as well. And I think the evidence, and there's still a lot of work they're doing to look at that, but I think there's evidence you get gradual buildup. Okay, sort of there'll be a gradual buildup of these kind of chemical residues in the soil. So I don't know the proper answer to that, but I do but I know there are conditions they can last for a fairly long time. There might be others on the kind of call. I know if you speak to the likes of who I share the stage with, Sally Ann Spence, kind of Rob Howe as well. There's quite a few experts kind of on that as well. So how long wormers chemicals? Oh yeah, I've done that one. With the on-farm effect testing machine, can you share it with the farm? Yes, you can share with farms. Other farms, we can share with up to 3 farms. We can have small community groups as well. The issue with sharing sometimes is we find one farmer uses it really well and the others don't. But we've got a couple of examples where we've got 2 or 3 farmers sharing one. Absolutely, that can happen. It's got to be convenient to you. It's got to be, when you've got time to do a test, the kit needs to be available. And how many sessions do you have using it? So you can do up to 100 samples. And if you're sharing, you can do up to 60 samples. And if you run out of your 60 or 100, you can buy more credits anyway. So buy more sample credits, but when you pay a subscription, it's normally enough for the majority of folk. And then another question from John Thorns. Have the worms got any predators that we could encourage? I'm organic and I have lots of soil life and fungi. Absolutely, they do have predators. They will have some predators, and there's various insects. I think, well, dung beetles, I'm not sure dung beetles are predators for it. I know they'll carry some other parasitic kind of stuff which would be predators of the larvae, within the dung. What I do know is with the dung beetles, the one great effect of dung beetles is if they're working away, getting rid of the dung heap, they're getting rid of the medium where those eggs survive. So the eggs need to be in the dung to be able to survive, to hatch, to develop, and they need that kind of medium. So if the dung beetles, for example, are destroying that, and we get birds coming in to peck away at dung beetles and other insects that are landing on there, we are quickly destroying our dung pats and therefore destroying a lot of the environment that we're helping those. So they'll probably, a lot of worms will die off naturally because of the effect of it, rather than being predated. I know there's been a lot of talk about, you mentioned fungi, there's been talk about some fungal kind of additives or feed additives that we could use. And we have some of these funguses. I can't remember the word for it now, but they will feed off the larvae, etc. There's been some work done in New Zealand, and they got quite excited about it, and we're going to have everybody feeding it, etc. I haven't really seen it take off, but there are there's potential options there. But I think commercially, to get them commercially working, there needs a bit more work on, because for that system, you need to be feeding like a concentrate or something to be able to put the fungal spores into, for them to be able to ingest and develop into the dung. So yeah, there are things, and you're looking at fluke, for example. One of the things that will predate not on the fluke but on the mud snails is things like ducks and geese and whatever and stuff. So you can put them kind of on your wet pastures and stuff, or attract some Canadian geese to come to your kind of streams and lakes or whatever. Question from Laura. What do you see the solution to wormer resistance looks like? Is it primarily prevention and less reliance on treatment, or is there an alternative? It's a very good question. A solution to wormer resistance, that would be very nice. There's no silver bullet, I'm afraid. And it's interesting in this, I didn't share slides with you, but in New Zealand, one of the solutions offered in New Zealand to resistance 15 years ago now, probably 20 years ago. So New Zealand were ahead of the game with us and they were doing lots of testing. And then we had the advent of combination wormers. And anybody been to New Zealand, you can't buy a single active wormer now. They're all combinations. We only have one combination here in the UK, a true combination of two wormers. We have combinations in terms of fluke and wormers combined, but I'm talking about combined combinations where there's two different wormer ingredients combined. We have that in StarTect, so that's a combination of the Quantil and ivermectin. But in New Zealand, you can buy combinations of a BZ, a white wormer and a yellow wormer mixed in the same drum and sold as that. We've got triple combinations there as well. So you've got white wormer, an ivermectin, and a yellow wormer all in the same drum. And that was sold as the answer to resistance. And it was well backed by science as well. We thought it was maybe a bit flaky, but it's the idea was if, the same worms won't be resistant to ivermectin, which are resistant to the white wormer. So the idea is the ivermectin will kill the white wormer resistant worms off, and the white wormer will kill the ivermectin resistant worms off. And the yellow wormers, you'll do it, and there'll be a bit of a mix round like that. And the modeling showed that we'd be protected for decades and decades and decades. There's a new piece of work we brought out last year in terms of our New Zealand team. Excuse me, in terms of our New Zealand team, where they are now finding combination wormers really failing. And I think and it's been trebling or doubling every year, every 3 years in the last 12 years. So 12 years ago, there was no triple combination resistance, to give you an example. And I think now they've got triple combination on about 30% of farms to some degree. And again, it's to some degree, it's the start of resistance, but it's there. And there's a couple of farms where the combinations are failing to quite a large degree as well. Okay, so that's worrying. So that's been sold as one solution. Having new wormers coming out. And we've obviously had Zolvix and StarTect now as the orange and purple group in the last few years. It's sort of in recent times then. But there's nothing new really on the way in terms of new wormers with different modes of action. I don't hear of anything that's going to come out, and you talk to the pharmaceuticals. They're not massively investing in it. There've been huge investments in stuff like Zolvix and StarTect, and it's failed. And and even within what do we had Zolvix now? Probably had Zolvix 15 years now, 14, 15 years, and we've already got some farms resistance. We've got a couple of farms in the UK with quite bad resistance. It works for the majority, don't get me wrong, but we've got to really treat them carefully, so it will develop quickly, and I'm sure it'll be the same for StarTect if we misuse StarTect as well. So new wormers aren't going to be the thing. So I think to answer your question, it's the second half of your question. It's prevention, less reliance on treatment, looking at alternatives in terms of management, etc., to try and manage the situation and reduce our intensity of doing it. There are people who think you can reintroduce susceptible worms to breed with the resistant ones and try to breed them out as well, but that's difficult to do because where do you buy your susceptible worms from? So yeah, worming less. There's a lot of content on the SCOPS website, for example, of leaving some animals untreated to provide susceptible worms to the next generation. Is called in refugia. Anybody want to ask a question? You're welcome to unmute if you want to ask a question. If you don't want to type away, and maybe everybody's shy hiding behind the keyboard.
Thank you so much, Eurion. Such a lot of great questions from the audience. Yeah, any last questions? We'll be seeing you again in March, though, won't we?
Absolutely. You can keep all your questions
If
till
anything
then.
comes up before then.
Yeah.
Well, Eurion, thank you so much. I'm just going to share some slides to
Oh, sorry, I
to
can stop
wrap up.
sharing as well.
No,
Yeah.
you're all right.
I don't realize I was still sharing that. Yeah, yeah.
So thank you so much, everybody. Before we finish up and thank Eurion once more, I'd just like to invite you to fill out a brief poll. And actually, I've realised I can't actually launch the poll whilst I've got the slides up. So it should be appearing on your screens now. Just a few short questions to give us some feedback about the webinar this evening. We'd be very grateful. Bryony, can you give me a thumbs up that that's happened? Brilliant. Thank you. So I'd just like to thank Eurion so much for such an informative and yeah, such a lot of knowledge that you've given us in that talk. And I can see your passion for the subject and your enthusiasm and your years of experience. And thank you so much for sharing those with us this evening. I'm very glad that you'll be back with us again in March to talk more about this topic. Um, and then my final just bit of information to share is that we do have many more webinars coming up. Our next online event is tomorrow evening, which is our Pasture for Life's annual general meeting. And that's featuring Greg Judy in conversation with Nikki Yoxall, our head of research. Next week, we have crop livestock integration with speakers from NIAB. And then I thought, since Rob Howe had been mentioned, I've added on here a very long-term trail that Rob Howe will be coming to speak to us next year on the exact topic that you mentioned there, Eurion, about the ecology of dung and how the ecology of a dung pack can interact with those parasites that you've been talking about and hopefully help to control them. And I too was at the dung beetle conference back in the summer and was really inspired by all of these talks about that too. So yeah, just a huge thank you, Eurion. I'm sorry that because we're not in a room, we can't all give you an actual audible clap, but I'll
All
give
right.
one on behalf of everyone here.
No problem.
Thank you so much for your time, and thank you everyone for joining us and such great questions that you've asked as well. And hope you all have a good evening.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for hanging on there and listening. Thank you.